Let's go ahead and dive in. MMFA always tells churches that theology is a key piece of what you're doing with stewardship in your ministry. What does the Bible tell us about stewardship? So, before we get into those 4 steps that I just mentioned that you can try this year, I do want to offer a brief word from Scripture to ground us. So, here you see very familiar verses from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. And notice here, as Jesus is speaking, that he's not telling those who are listening to be salt. He doesn't say to them to try to be salt. He says, you are salt. You are the salt of the earth. And this is really wonderful stewardship text to be thinking about. So salt in Jesus's time, of course, was really, really extraordinary. It preserved food. It prevented infection. It was used as payment even. I learned as I was developing this webinar that the root of our word salary, it comes from the word for salt. The Romans said that salt was born of the sun and the sea, and the Greeks associated salt with the divine. So truly for Jesus to say, we are salt of the earth is significant. So, what does that mean for our stewardship? And this is the reframe that I want to go ahead and offer as we begin today, which is, again, that stewardship is not primarily about what we give, it's about who we are. Who are we as salt of the earth and light of the world, beloved children of God? We matter to God. We know that, right? So, what we do with our time, our talent, our treasure, everything, our whole lives carries weight, and it can have flavor, and it can make a difference that lasts. So, I like to say, think of it this way: God loves me so much. And I mean so much to God that I get to use what God has entrusted to me for God's work in the world. That is salty stewardship. That's being salt of the earth, light of the world. That's generosity that preserves, that adds flavor and makes a difference. Jesus as goes on and says, you're the light of the world. And we know that we shine the brightest when we are pointing away from ourselves and toward God. So our acts of service, our care for others, our generosity, these are all witness, and not to how great we are, but to how great God is. So today we're going to explore a little bit more about what it means to add salt to our stewardship in our churches. But I feel like it's always important for us to begin our time together looking at some verses from Scripture and really thinking about what stewardship means in terms of our relationship with God. So let's dig into our first step. As we get ready to think about stewardship in 2026, the first thing that you want to do is know your ingredients. Just like a cook has to know that they've got the right things on hand before they start working on a dish, our congregations need to inventory what God has entrusted to them before anything can be used for God's work in the world. Stewardship's not about what we need. It starts with gratitude and awareness of what's already there. What does our church already have? Encourage you to begin by asking a question. What do we actually have as a church? There is an abundance of resources within your walls and even beyond. So take some time to be thinking about, what do we already have that we can build on, that we can use? What has God entrusted to us that we can put to God's work in the world? One way that you can do this, you see there, is to conduct a community asset inventory. What are the skills, the spaces, the networks, the relationships, the resources, and the energies that exist at your church? It's a great way to take stock. You may be thinking, hey, we've done that before. I would invite you to consider, when did you do it? When was the last time that you did something like this? And is it time to do it again? A lot has changed. A lot changes on any given year. But if it's been several years since you took stock, did your inventory, would encourage you to consider whether it's the right time to do it again. It can really be tempting to get stuck on what we don't have, what we used to have, what we miss that was part of our church in the past. That can lead to scarcity mindset, which is dangerous as we're trying to grow faithful and generous stewards. And we know that Scripture tells us a different story. Think about the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and the 12 baskets remaining. So again, begin, what do we actually have, and conduct an inventory to make that list. Then consider your message. Most congregations unconsciously equate stewardship with fundraising. The pledge or the commitment card or the church budget even become the whole conversation. And the time of year that we talk about stewardship is when that budget's being formed. And when this happens, stewardship can start to feel a little bit like a money issue dressed up in theological clothing, so to speak. And that's just a dramatically incomplete understanding of what it is to be God's stewards. The biblical word that is most often translated stewardship literally means the management of a household. And we all know that a household is more than just a bank account, right? A household is relationships, time, property, skills, reputation, influence, all kinds of things go in to managing our household. So a steward is responsible for all of this, not just that one financial piece. So if whole life stewardship is the goal and managing your church household, so to speak, then the pledge card doesn't disappear, but it just takes its proper place amongst all the other ingredients that are there in your pantry. And the stewardship conversation expands to include those other ingredients that you have in there because we know that the pantry isn't empty. God has entrusted all of our communities of faith with so many gifts. So you're identifying those, you're inventorying them, and you're making sure that they are all part of your stewardship conversation. You've got, again, time and skill, space and property, relationships, passions. You've got people sitting in the pews that really care deeply about the community that want to make a difference. There's financial resources in there, of course, as well. So reframe, again, as a whole life scope. What's in there. That can oftentimes re-engage people who aren't feeling maybe like their non-financial gifts to the church matter. So oftentimes people who aren't intentional about financial commitments get re-engaged when they see that bigger picture and learn that all of what we do matters in the life and the ministries of the church. If you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm at a church that doesn't use pledge cards, I strongly encourage you to consider adding that ingredient to your church life this year. Not because it's going to mean something to help you budget as you get ready to head towards 2027, but really for what it means when you invite people to make a financial commitment, a commitment of any kind, really, to God, what it does for their relationship with God. So those pledge cards can be a really important discipleship piece as you're thinking about what your church is going to do this year for stewardship. So once we know our ingredients, we are ready to think about some action ideas. So here are a few practical ways to know your ingredients. Again, having an asset inventory Sunday, you can have members come to that with already their own list of their individual gifts, the skills that they have, relationships that they have, resources that they bring to the church. You can compile all of these into sort of a living Moravian Church ingredient list for the congregation. If you've ever done asset mapping, community-based asset mapping, this is a little bit different because you're asking people to think about those individual gifts, and congregational asset mapping is about the church's resources, right? But there's some overlap between the two, and you could certainly merge them into one exciting Sunday of a congregational asset inventorying step. Then you can create an actual map, literally map your church. Where is the building? Where do your members live? Where do they work? What are the community organizations that are within a certain mile radius of the church? What's in your neighborhood? And begin to see those different assets physically on a map. You can also create space as well on that map for things like time and availability. If you know that you've got 10 retired members at your church that all have Tuesday morning free, that time, that availability is a really wonderful piece of actionable information. So maybe your asset map includes people's time, their expertise as well, and not just those physical things. But this is a wonderful way to have gifts, assets visibly in front of the church and to weave it into ongoing conversations around stewardship and mission. The next thing you see there on the slide is the ABCD Institute's, some of their tools. If you're not familiar with them, that's the Asset-Based Community Development Institute. I will make sure you have a link to them, and you can also Google them and find them. But they have two really exciting tools that individuals can use. The 4-H One is a way for people to identify gifts that they have of the head, the heart, the hands, and then habits. And then that other tool that I mentioned here, the Know, Teach, Learn, invites people to consider, what do I know? What can I teach other people? And what do I want to learn? So again, it's a way to activate your folks to discover and name their own gifts, and then to work together to put those gifts into sort of the, again, ingredient list for the congregation as you think about, how do we want to make a difference this year? So all of those are components of stewardship that really matter as you're thinking about setting some goals and some plans for the year. Another really fun thing to do in this space of knowing your ingredients is to form a little stewardship discovery team, 3 to 5 people. And their only job for 90 days is to go out and name all the gifts that they see in the congregation, and then to bring those back together and to celebrate them, to thank people for them. You could have a different stewardship discovery team work in the next 90 days, and their possibilities are limitless. This is an activity that I think gives churches energy. It's fun. And people feel good when they are thanked for their gifts, when gifts are celebrated. Again, sometimes we accidentally overspend time on how we ask people to give, and we forget to name those gifts and to say thank you for them and to celebrate. So that stewardship discovery team, just a fun little 90-day ad hoc group that's out making those lists of the gifts that they see, and then connecting them to gratitude and Thanksgiving. Finally, encourage you, if you do use a pledge or a commitment card of some sort, consider whether it's worth redesigning it. There are some churches that now also give people space on that financial commitment card to indicate ways that they are going to commit their time, ways that they're going to commit their talents. This is not the same thing as a time and talent inventory. If you've ever used one of those, this is different. This is someone being able to say, hey, in the next year, I plan to commit my time in this way to the church, or my talents in this way to the church. So again, it helps people know that their gifts of all kinds matter in the life of the congregation, and that those are valued and important as well. Now for a few metrics. Again, if our goal in knowing our ingredients is to build awareness, to encourage abundance mindsets, then the metrics that we want to consider are ones that reflect sort of that discovery type mode. So you see 4 there on the slide. I'm not going to talk through each one, but just different things that you could measure as you are working to know your ingredients this year. And finally, discussion questions. Again, I'm not going to read through every single one of these, and you don't need to worry about trying to read them right now. While I'm talking, they'll be part of what we send to you. But it's really important to us, to MMFA, that you don't go straight into what are we going to do mode after this webinar, that you have some questions that are what we hope will bear into fruitful conversation to then help you figure out what you're going to do, right? So again, you'll get these as part of the handouts, but just wanted you to know that this discussion discernment part is really, really important. And you've got some good questions there that can guide you as you focus on knowing your ingredients. Would encourage you, if you're at a church where you've got a unified board, joint board, these are great for them. If you've got a stewardship committee, super, would love for them to dig in a few of these as well. But always great for the, sort of your top level of church leadership to be thinking about things like this. All right, step 2, we're going to season the neighborhood. Why? Because salt doesn't stay in the shaker. A church that has taken the time to inventory and take stock of its gifts, its ingredients, now has the chance to follow the call to use those gifts. Again, not primarily inward for the benefit of the congregation, but outwardly into the neighborhood where the salt's really going to do great work, God's work. So this step is going to move us a little bit from stewardship as an act of maintenance. Let's make sure we can keep doing what we've been doing, keep the doors open, pay the bills, into one of mission, which is really life-giving to a congregation. But before you are ready to season, you've got to take a little bit of time to do some listening, to make sure that you're closing a gap if there is one that exists between what the church assumes the neighborhood and the community needs versus what actually is their experience. So you see, first thing to do as you're thinking about seasoning is to ask your neighbors. Take the time to talk to people in the neighborhood, and really by talking, I mean listening to people in the neighborhood. What are their concerns? What needs do they have? have? What do they wish were different in the neighborhood? If there are any kind of social service agencies close to your church, listening to them as well. If you, in your taking stock of your ingredients step, have identified some of those connections that your members have, relationships in the community, this is time to put those to work. Get a chance to sit down and talk to the principal of the local school or the head of a social service agency that works with people who are unhoused. Whatever it is that's within the neighborhood, take some time to listen. Next thing that you want to do or can do is build a community profile. And I've listed a tool there that I only discovered probably in the last 6 months, and it's amazing. It's the Association of Religious Data Archives, ARDA. So they have a community profile builder, which is free. You go on their site, you see it there. It'll again be in your handouts, and you are invited to put in the street address of your church. Then you can say, I want a 1 mile radius. I want a 2 mile radius, three, whatever the mile radius is that you'd like. And then it will generate a community profile for you. What's in that profile? Amazing demographic information with details about housing, income, education, employment, religion, and much more. So it can really help you see what your neighborhood looks like and possibly identify some of those needs that exist. Utilized this recently with a church here in Winston-Salem, and it was interesting to see how within a 1 mile radius of their church, highly affluent, highly educated neighborhood, but then as they zoomed out and thought about the people they were serving and the population of the county in which they lived, it was a very different profile. So it's a great way to give you more information as you're thinking about how you want to use those gifts that you've identified to make a difference in the neighborhood. So the arda.com, highly recommend. MMFA, happy to build a report for your church, bring it to you, work with your board around it. That can be a lot of fun and really, again, eye-opening and fruitful conversation. So the next thing you do, you've talked to the neighbors, you've listened to them, you've built your profile, you've gathered information about the neighborhood. Now it's the chance to say, what are the gifts we have and how can they help make a difference with these needs? People get burned out easily in ministry. You all know this. If you're trying to meet a need that the church is not well equipped to meet. So I'll give you an example of that. If you've got a congregation where you have 3 retired nurses and a really wonderful kitchen off your fellowship hall, let's say, that might not be the right church to try to start a youth literacy program, but it might be the perfect time to say, hey, could we do some kind of wellness workshops, chronic disease management type stuffs when these retired nurses are free. So again, it's looking at those gifts that God has entrusted to you and saying, how can these specific gifts meet needs? Next thing that I invite you to consider is hyper-local stewardship. What would it look like if your church said, we're going to go all in within X mile radius of our church building on this one specific need? A lot of churches support many causes and partner with a lot of different agencies that are doing good, and this is good. But hyper-local stewardship can really be invigorating, especially if you're at a smaller congregation where folks feel pulled in a lot of different directions and there aren't enough people to do the good things that the church wants to do. So again, invitation to consider, we're going to go dig really deep with this one need in our neighborhood, really build meaningful relationships around it. And this actually positions you to probably be better able to see if things are improving. If you're all in on this one need, and you're putting your resources towards it, time, energy, et cetera, in relationship with people in the community around it, you're more likely to be able to say, hey, is this making a difference? Are we moving the needle any with this need? So again, this is kind of the saying something like, this year we are deepening our work in the South Side neighborhood by partnering with X ministry or X particular agency. And people then know exactly where their gifts, whether it's time, talent, or treasure, are going to be making a difference. And that leads nicely sort of into the last point on this slide, excuse me, connecting your communications, your asks around stewardship with tangible impact. So making sure that you're telling stories in ways that help people see how their acts of stewardship are really making a difference. If we go back to that example of the church who has the retired nurses and they are now hosting some wellness classes, then the story here might be getting a quote from some people who've attended those classes, what impact did it have on them, as well as those nurses that are running it, and being able to, as you invite people to give, to support it, say. Here's actual words from somebody who this particular ministry has benefited. So, a few specific action ideas. Again, I mentioned it before, that 1 mile commitment. What's one tangible need within a 1 mile radius that you're going to commit real sustained resources to for a year? Another idea is to add a dedicated line item in your church budget for hyperlocal community investment. Even a small amount tells the congregation, hey, this is really important, and invites generosity to it. Another idea is to form those local partnerships, one neighborhood institution where you're showing up again and again. It's not just one event a year, but a sustained relationship where you're there and helping in the ways that they need, not the ways that the church might think they need, of course. If you're thinking, oh, we've already got some local partnerships, great. I would encourage you to evaluate those. How deep do they go? How many people from the congregation are involved with them? Who's setting the agenda for what that work looks like? Does someone from the organization get invited to have input with the church as you're making decisions about ministry priorities or even budget? And if your pastor left, would this partnership survive, or is it one that's primarily cultivated by your pastor? So these kinds of questions are important because you want to ensure that that relationship is transformative, not just for the church, but also for the organization and those that it serves. And being able every year to kind of assess those relationships, those partnerships, is a healthy step to take. And then finally, would encourage you to consider having a SALT commissioning Sunday. So during this special worship service, the congregation is symbolically committing resources to the neighborhood and the flourishing of the neighborhood, specific needs in the neighborhood. And the big key here for this service is that members are being sent out. They're not just signing up. They're not just turning something in per se, but it's really a commissioning to send them out to make a difference. And I think this can be a wonderful celebration to add as part of your stewardship actions for the year. Next, let's look at some metrics quickly. Again, if the goal here, we're seasoning the neighborhood, we are in outward movement with our gifts, then however you're measuring these steps should reflect community impact. So you see a few different ways that you possibly could put some measurements in place to see if what you're doing to season the neighborhood is making a difference. And finally, of course, some discussion questions. Again, encourage you to take these back to the appropriate group. Maybe it's a mission committee. If you've got a group of folks that are really primarily working around those community partnerships that already exist, these would be great questions for them to think about too, or your board, your stewardship committee, whoever that needs to be. So our third step is preserving what matters. One of SALT's oldest functions, as you know, is preservation, protecting what's valuable from going bad. So what does this mean for stewardship? It means thinking about the long game, long term, and primarily how are you forming the next generation of stewards? What disciplines, what values, what stewardship practices are being preserved and passed on to those who are younger, and not in a way that keeps the church from evolving and changing. This doesn't mean preserve as is. This means preserve those things that are essential to who your church is as a faithful steward and how it utilizes its gifts, how it forms people to understand stewardship and what that means for us in our relationship with God. So again, it's not about preservation mode to keep things as they are, but it's about helping ensure that faithful and generous stewards are being formed year after year. So developmental research, if you've ever worked with children, you know that kids as young as 3 can demonstrate generous behavior. And then by the age of 6, most kids have a good understanding of what fairness is about, what it means to share. So this tells us that stewardship formation should begin in early childhood. So here you see some different steps to take in this preservation mode, thinking about what you want children to understand about stewardship. before you start digging in is important. Not just when are we going to start, but what do we want them to learn? What does our ideal adult steward look like, and what curriculum can we pick that's going to help us start teaching children in that way? Obviously, you want a whole life focus, not something that's primarily centered on financial stewardship. And then, of course, you want something that's really grounded in biblical stewardship, what the scripture tells us about being stewards, and a curriculum that includes lots of practices for them to try. And ideally, this could align with what adults are learning about stewardship as well, which leads us into the next point of intergenerational connectivity. Oftentimes, when children are learning things in Sunday school, our adults may or may not be learning anything similar to what our kids are learning. And I think this is a real opportunity for some alignment for stewardship. So making sure that adults, especially the parents of those children, in your CE program are also learning about stewardship as well. And in addition, intergenerational connectivity around stewardship can really be of value. You've got elders in your pews who carry a lot of lived wisdom with them about stewardship and generosity, and how they can look back and see their relationship with God changing over time as they've stewarded what God has entrusted to them. And no curriculum can replicate this. So how can you connect your younger members with your older members so that they can learn from one another in the stewardship space? And then finally, you see pass it on. So ultimately, preservation's, again, not about keeping the church doors open. It's about sharing a way of life that's what God wants for all of us. So congregations that are doing this well, that are passing it on, are telling their own story, making sure people know that story, that they celebrate the past, connecting it with the present. This looks like involving younger generations in real decisions about the church. What's their dream church look like? What needs do they see that worry them, that they would like to make a difference in, that kind of thing? How are their gifts identified and put to use? And then finally, also being able to connect to the future. A great example of this, I was at a church, and it just happened. They weren't doing anything intentional, but I heard an older member telling a teenager, oh, well, this building was built in this year, and we were only able to build it because this particular group raised this money, and then this happened. So they told them the history of this particular physical space at the church, but then went on to say to the young person, what can you think of different ways we could use this space that might be part of the life and the mission that we're up to as a church? And so it was neat to see them do that past, present, future right there, and sort of pass on some stewardship thoughts that would form this young person and involve them in the future of this part of their church. So preserving what matters is a really important step to take as you think about stewardship this year. Here are some specific ways you can put it into action. So a youth generosity program or project, excuse me. This means just giving a youth group a budget of a few $100s and letting them decide how they want to use it in the neighborhood or the community. And that act of them coming together and mutually having to come to an agreement on how that money is going to be spent is formative for them. And it gives you also the opportunity to help them learn about sort of transactional versus transformational stewardship. What does that mean? Well, they could easily say, we're going to take this $200 and we're going to go give it to the Humane Society. And that would be a transactional, generous act, but is it transformational? What you really want is a relationship, a connection that goes beyond just writing a check. So it's a great way to help expose them to that particular component of stewardship. Another idea is to make sure that you've got resources for your families for stewardship. Again, if kids start learning about it in Sunday school, how can you help parents feel comfortable talking about it? What do they understand about it as well? And then even having tools that they can choose to deploy on their own time in their home to teach their kids about stewardship beyond what the church is doing. This is really, really important. You don't have to come up with these resources on your own. They already exist, and MMFA would be happy to help connect you with some great ones. Next, collecting and sharing generosity stories. Again, this could be a potential intergenerational activity. You could have youth interviewing folks in the church, give them questions that they're going to ask. They could record answers, and then you start to have this beautiful archive of the voices of your ministry over the years, talking about what stewardship means to them, what generosity means to them. You could easily ask your members to submit their own stories. I think sometimes that can be hard to do. I know churches that have tried that and felt disappointed that they didn't get more stories. So I think a neat way would be to make it really personal and have folks that are doing some interviews and collecting those. Finally, a mentorship program is a great way to preserve what matters most as you think about stewardship. I know a lot of our churches pair up children or youth when they're in confirmation class with a mentor. That's a great place to start. How can you expand on that so that that mentorship continues as they become young adults? Or a mentorship could be between two adults. I know a lot of Moravians who are very gifted in different areas, woodworking, gardening, knitting, etc. So there may be particular hobbies or skills where somebody says, hey, I want to learn that. I need a mentor in that area. And it evolves into a broader mentorship. But it's a good place to start to pair people up based on something someone has gifts with and a person who wants to learn how to do that. So mentorship, again, could be between a young person and an adult, or it also could be between two adults. So here you see some metrics. As we think about preserving what matters, that's relational work, connecting people and helping them form trust and get to know one another. That takes time. So these metrics that you see here are of course, this work's going to be slower, but it's really, really important and again, can be very life-giving to the congregation. And finally, some discussion questions for you to have good conversation around this particular step. Now, I want to make sure if you're thinking right now, we don't have a lot of children and youth at our church, so not really sure what this preserve what matters step means for us. So here's some encouragements that you can still do this work, even if you feel like you don't have a lot of kids or young people in your pews right now. First thing is to look at the next generation a little bit differently. Perhaps there are young adults in the neighborhood that don't have a church background, college students at a campus that's nearby, young families through a community partnership. So look again at those relationships that you have. Where is the church outside of its building in community with others? And who are the younger adults that are there? Are they folks that you can form relationships with and still be transmitting the values of the church to those beyond its walls? Then look inside for a bit. Even if you don't have kids, you probably have members who are in their 40s and their 50s that might be younger than your average. And these adults, sometimes data shows us that they are less involved in congregational life and even in congregational decision making. So as you think about your church's story, its institutional memory, and who has access to that and who doesn't, there may be a gap, and these adults, again, 40s and 50s, might be that next generation that are worth your attention and your steps to be in relationship with them. Another way to preserve what matters is to form relationships with a younger congregation. Maybe there is a church that needs space, a new church that's got younger folks in it that need space that you could let them use space in your building. Maybe it's to do ministry together, to partner and say, we're stronger as two. What can we do together to make a difference in the neighborhood? And maybe they're already up to stuff in the neighborhood and you say, hey, we've got resources that we can put towards supporting that. So again, it's a little bit different, might be kind of scary and beyond the comfort zone of some people in your church. But another way that you can preserve what matters to your community of faith. Always encourage folks to spend time in discernment if you are thinking we don't have a lot of kids and youth. What does preservation mean if we don't feel like we've got this next generation who is present to be part of the church in future years? So if this is the case and you're thinking about how to sort of transmit those values, the stories, the resources, you can do that without young people in your pews. It's just going to look different. So again, can be a little scary and it can be hard, but it can surface certainly the pain that might exist. It's a reality if you don't have children and youth that are involved in the congregation, that hurts. And so some time around discernment about how that feels and how you still can be good stewards of what God has entrusted to you is worth the energy and the effort. And MMFA happy to help facilitate some of this if that would be of benefit. And then finally, you can still pass it on. Again, it'll look a little bit different too. It could be focus on what members want the congregation's resources to accomplish. Are there neighborhood partnerships that you want to endow even? Are there ministries that you want to support that are going to outlive people in the congregation? So this is, again, often an unexplored form of preservation, but it can be very important for the life of the church. And let's look at our fourth and final step as we think about salty stewardship, adding a little friction. Um, Salt changes things, doesn't it? It changes our blood pressure. It can, but it can make you thirsty. It can even sting. And as we think about that and how Jesus modeled loving truth telling, salty truth telling, especially when he talked about money, then faithful stewardship invites us to ask hard questions. Questions about wealth, questions about inequality, questions about transparency. And oftentimes there's a gap between what we say we're about and what we say we believe and how we're actually doing things and how we're spending money specifically. So here you see several questions that could add a little friction to your stewardship conversation and steps in 2026. How does your church talk about money? Do you only talk about money when you're asking for it? Do you only talk about money once a year at your identified stewardship season, your financial appeal? Do you only talk about money, or do you talk about money because you're sharing budgetary shortfalls in your bulletin every week? Please stop doing that. Happy to talk more about that at another time. So think honestly, how do we talk about money? Because there's always room for growth in this particular conversation point. And step one, as you're trying to be more honest about how you talk about money and work on it, is to never talk about money outside of the church's mission. That is a whole other webinar for another day. But if you're going to talk about money with your congregation, make sure you're talking about mission and making that connection with how money enables the church to accomplish a mission that is God's mission for your particular community of faith. Second, how do you identify obstacles to financial stewardship? What's keeping people from giving? I've spent a lot of time in a lot of meetings, I bet you have too, where we're all coming up with the reasons that we think are keeping people from giving money to the church. There's always room to listen and to learn as we try to remove obstacles. So I would encourage you to figure out what's the right step for our church to try to identify these and to try to learn from people if they're not engaged in the way that we hope for them to be with all aspects of stewardship, but especially with financial. Third, budget and budgeting process. Are they fully transparent to the congregation? And what would change if they were? This is a big one. A lot of churches think that they're open and honest about the budget and how the church trustees come up with the budget, but there's always room for improvement. Again, you can probably never over communicate about this, but again, MFA happy to provide some transparency tips for what we think is healthy in communicating about budgeting and budgeting processes. And then finally, and possibly most importantly, actions speak louder than words, don't they? So does your church spend money in ways that align with its values, its mission, its vision? If I show up as a visitor and you tell me we are all about supporting the people in our community who are experiencing homelessness, but I don't see anybody giving time for that, I don't see any money going to that, then I'm not going to believe that you're about what you say you're about, right? So this is taking some time to really, again, look at your line item budget and make sure it lines up and is reflective of what the says it's about, its vision that it's hoping to achieve, its mission that it's on. I like to say it this way. If I sit here and tell you I'm all about health and wellness, and you look in my car and you see receipts from McDonald's and an empty box from Krispy Kreme, clearly my actions and my words are not in alignment. So it's really, really critical before you start talking about stewardship in any way this year to take the time to look honestly at your budget and make sure that everyone is comfortable with the amount of money that's supporting the different ministries that are those that uphold the values that you have as a congregation. Action ideas for adding friction. I love this first one, money and faith small groups. So a chance to let people look at finances through a faith lens. Topics like debt, giving, consumption, economic inequality, anxiety around money. These groups are for any generation. So if you're already thinking, oh, we've got older folks in our congregation, they don't need to learn anything or talk about money and faith. Yes, it's for everybody. When MFA has facilitated small groups like this around financial faith and finances, excuse me, it's been a delight to have somebody in the group who's 80 and somebody in the group who's 25. So I would encourage you to see how can we form some small groups to have meaningful conversation about faith and finances. There are all kinds of great short books that you could use to base your discussion on. Be happy to share ideas with you about that if this is something that you think would be worth your congregation's time. Second thing there that you see is a congregational stewardship reflection guide. So I think a lot of people are here on the call today. I've been involved with your church's stewardship before, and I know that you have a time of year when you focus on it and you have folks who are speaking to gifts and opportunities in the community and wonderful things in advance of inviting folks to make financial commitments. Keep doing that, but consider adding a reflection guide that you can send out to people prior to that time of year that gives them things to be thinking about. It could be a form of a mirror for people to hold up so that they can spend time in prayer, in conversation with their family, but give them a little more that they can have at home and that they can spend time and energy on outside of the church walls as you're talking about stewardship. So again, happy to provide ideas for what that guide could include. Third, you see there a sermon series on money. So hopefully you have a pastor, or if you are a pastor, you're in a church where you are supported and encouraged to preach about money, and hopefully more than once a year. And if you follow the lectionary, it would encourage you to be sure to identify those texts that would lend themselves easily to rich stewardship sermons and get those on the calendar and make sure that it's something that you are preaching about more than once a year. When MMFA has done surveys in the past of lay people around stewardship and what they want from their church for it, you would be surprised by the majority of people that really want their pastor to teach them about it. They are looking to clergy as the experts here and want to hear more about what the Bible is saying about stewardship. So having sermons about money, highly encourage that to be part of your plan for the year. And then finally, you see Budget Town Hall. This is just a chance to get everybody together to talk about the budget, not just as a vote to approve it, but to have conversation about where the money is going, why, how the decisions were made to get there. What does it say about the church's priorities? What should we change to really engage people in a more reciprocal conversation about the budget? If you've ever taken MMFA Stewardship Health Assessment, there's a section on it that asks you to think about whether you ask the congregation for input in the budget. If not, why not? So this is something to consider as you think about budgeting for 2027. What would the congregation say about how the church should spend its money? It could be worth some time and energy. And let's look at some metrics for adding friction. So adding friction, really the goal here is to change culture, to change mindsets around stewardship generally, but money specifically. So you're going to see metrics suggested here that reflect openness and transformation. Again, this doesn't happen overnight. People don't instantly feel comfortable talking about money, but with intentionality and work, you can shift them to be a little bit more open. Again, you see that second bullet point there. Hey, I feel more comfortable talking about money and faith than I did a year ago. So again, different ways that you can measure the openness and the transformation that's happening as you think more specifically about financial stewardship. Discussion questions, of course, for the appropriate group to be considering. Trustees come to my mind just because they are charged, of course, with that budget, but it may again be a joint board, unified board activity. Stewardship committee certainly thinking about these. Worked with some churches before where the stewardship committee is taking this kind of conversation on and then come to the full board with some recommendations. And so again, just whatever's right for your context, but I think it's worth spending some time thinking honestly about how your church talks about money. If it doesn't, how can it talk about money in a way that's healthy and that's forming faithful stewards? We know God doesn't want our money, right? God wants our hearts, but certainly money is a big part of our lives. And we've got a wonderful model in Jesus in terms of how he talked and taught about money. So I hope that you will spend some time in conversation around these discussion questions as you think about how to add a little friction and shift your practices as you talk about money this year. So those are our 4 steps. I'm going to open it up